Imagine for a moment that every thought in your mind is like a seed. Some seeds grow into strength, clarity, and unstoppable confidence, while others grow into doubt, fear, and hesitation. The question is, which seeds are you watering every day? Every single one of us has an inner voice, a constant narrator that speaks to us in every moment. But here's the truth. Most people allow that voice to control them instead of mastering it. What if I told you that the key to unbreakable mental strength doesn't lie in changing the world outside, but in training the voice inside your own head? By the end of this video, you will understand how to take complete control of your inner dialogue, transform fear into clarity, and turn every challenge into a stepping stone for growth. You're about to learn the science behind resilience, the subtle patterns that shape your mind, and the exact strategies that can make your inner voice your most powerful ally. So if you're ready to stop being sabotaged by doubt, to silence the self-criticism, and to unlock a level of mental toughness you didn't think was possible, then pay close attention, because what I'm about to share could completely change the way you think, act, and perform in every area of your life. The inner voice most people experience feels deeply personal, almost like a core part of who they are, but in reality, it is the result of repeated neural activity shaped over time. From a brain perspective, this voice is a network of circuits built through experience, emotion, reinforcement, and repetition. Early environments, authority figures, social feedback, stress, and success or failure all contribute to how this voice sounds. Each repeated thought strengthens a specific neural pathway, making that pattern more likely to activate again in similar situations. Over time, the brain begins to automate these responses because automation conserves energy. What feels like "this is just how I am" is actually the brain running a well-rehearsed program. This distinction matters because identity feels fixed, while neural patterns are plastic. If the inner voice were truly your identity, it would be unchangeable. Neuroscience shows the opposite. The brain constantly rewires itself in response to attention and repetition. When a thought pattern is activated frequently, synaptic connections strengthen. When it is interrupted or replaced consistently, those connections weaken. This is why someone can sound confident in one area of life and highly critical in another. The identity hasn't changed, the trained circuits are different. Stress plays a major role in reinforcing these patterns. Under pressure, the brain prioritizes speed over accuracy and defaults to familiar neural routes. If self-criticism has been practiced more than self-regulation, it becomes the automatic response during challenge. This doesn't mean the voice is truthful or useful, it simply means it has been practiced. The brain does not distinguish between helpful repetition and harmful repetition, it only tracks frequency and emotional intensity. Understanding the inner voice as a trained pattern creates psychological distance. Instead of reacting to thoughts as commands, they can be observed as outputs of conditioning. This observation alone begins to change neural firing because attention shifts from emotional reactivity to conscious awareness. When awareness is present, the prefrontal cortex becomes more active, allowing regulation rather than impulse. Over time, repeatedly noticing and redirecting the inner voice weakens old circuits and strengthens new ones. This process does not require suppressing thoughts or forcing positivity. It requires consistency in noticing, labeling, and choosing a different response. Each small interruption signals to the brain that an alternative pathway is relevant. With enough repetition, the tone, speed, and content of the inner voice gradually shift because the brain adapts to what is practice. Most often, the nervous system plays a central role in how the inner voice behaves, especially under stress. When the body perceives pressure, uncertainty, or threat, the brain shifts into a survival-oriented state. In this state, the amygdala becomes more active and signals the release of stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals prepare the body for rapid response, but they also reduce access to areas of the brain responsible for rational thought, emotional regulation, and long-term planning. As a result, the inner voice becomes louder, more reactive, and more negative, not because the situation is worse, but because the brain is operating in a heightened state of defense. In moments of stress, the brain is not focused on accuracy or nuance. Its priority is speed and protection. This is why self-talk under pressure often becomes absolute and catastrophic. Using language like always, never, or I can't handle this, the brain is attempting to predict danger quickly, even if those predictions are distorted. If the nervous system remains dysregulated, this type of inner dialogue can dominate, reinforcing fear-based thinking and reducing resilience over time. Regulating the nervous system changes this dynamic at a biological level. Simple physiological actions, such as slow, controlled breathing, muscle relaxation, or grounding attention in sensory input, send signals of safety to the brain. When these signals are received, the release of stress hormones decreases and activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. This shift allows for clearer thinking, better emotional control, and a more balanced inner voice. The content of self-talk often improves naturally once the body exits a state of alarm. Without regulation, attempts to think positively often fail because they are working against biology. A stressed nervous system resists cognitive reframing because it interprets effortful thinking as additional threat. This is why resilience is built from the bottom up, starting with the body rather than the mind. When physiological arousal is managed, mental strategies become accessible and effective. Over time, consistent nervous system regulation trains the brain to associate stress with control rather than panic. This association reduces the intensity and duration of negative inner dialogue during future challenges. The inner voice becomes less reactive and more adaptive, not through force or suppression, but through repeated signals of safety that reshape how the brain responds to pressure. Awareness is the mechanism that interrupts automatic mental behavior. Most inner dialogue operates below conscious attention, running as a background process that influences emotion, posture, decision-making, and performance without being questioned. When thoughts remain unnoticed, they are experienced as reality rather than interpretation. The brain treats them as accurate signals, triggering emotional and physiological responses that reinforce the original thought. This loop continues because there is no interruption between stimulus and reaction. The moment a thought is consciously noticed, a separation occurs between the observer and the mental event. This separation is not philosophical, it is neurological. Awareness activates regions of the prefrontal cortex associated with monitoring, evaluation, and executive control. At the same time, reactivity in emotional centers decreases. The thought does not disappear, but its authority weakens. It becomes something the brain is generating rather than something that defines action. This distance creates choice. Without awareness, behavior is reflexive. With awareness, multiple response options become available. A person can pause, regulate breathing, reframe language, or decide not to engage with the thought at all. Each of these choices alters neural firing patterns. The brain learns that not every thought requires action, which reduces emotional intensity, and cognitive load. Over time, repeated awareness strengthens metacognitive capacity, the ability to think about thinking. This capacity is a core component of resilience because it allows individuals to remain functional under pressure. Instead of being overwhelmed by internal noise, they can track it, label it, and let it pass. Labeling a thought as stress response or fear-based prediction reduces its emotional charge because the brain no longer interprets it as an urgent directive. Awareness also disrupts identification. When people identify with their inner voice, they experience its content as a statement about who they are. Awareness reframes it as a transient neural event shaped by context, fatigue, and past conditioning. This reframing reduces self-judgment and increases adaptability. The brain becomes more flexible when it is not defending a fixed self-concept. Over time, the repeated act of noticing thoughts without immediate reaction weakens habitual patterns. Neural pathways that depend on automatic engagement lose strength, while pathways associated with observation and regulation grow stronger. This gradual shift changes how challenges are experienced. Instead of triggering immediate stress and self-criticism, difficulty becomes information that can be processed with clarity and control. Language is not just a tool for communication, it is a regulator of brain chemistry and emotional state. The words used internally activate neural networks that influence how the brain interprets experience. Certain phrases automatically trigger threat responses, while others promote problem-solving and emotional stability. This occurs because language is tightly linked to memory, emotion, and prediction systems in the brain. When specific words are repeated, they prime the nervous system to expect particular outcomes, shaping both perception and behavior. Negative or absolute language tends to activate stress pathways. Phrases like, "I can't," "this always happens," or "I'm not good enough" compress complex situations into fixed conclusions. The brain interprets these conclusions as signals of danger or limitation, increasing cortisol and narrowing attention. This narrowing reduces creativity, flexibility, and resilience. Under these conditions, the inner voice becomes rigid, reinforcing the same emotional state that produced the language in the first place. In contrast, adaptive language keeps neural systems open. When internal dialogue shifts to phrases such as, "this is challenging," "I'm learning," or "this is temporary," the brain interprets the situation as manageable rather than threatening. This shift does not deny difficulty, it reframes it in a way that maintains access to higher cognitive functions. Dopamine and other neuromodulators associated with motivation and learning are more likely to be released when the brain perceives progress or possibility. Even under stress, the brain is highly sensitive to precision in language. Vague or exaggerated words create exaggerated emotional responses. Precise language reduces unnecessary emotional amplification. For example, replacing "everything is going wrong" with "this part needs adjustment" lowers physiological arousal and increases problem-solving capacity. This is not about forced positivity, it is about accuracy. The brain responds better to accurate signals than dramatic ones. Over time, repeated use of constructive language reshapes default emotional responses. Neural pathways associated with calm assessment and persistence become stronger, while those linked to panic and self-attack weaken. The shift directly impacts resilience because resilient individuals are not free from stress, they interpret stress differently. Their internal language guides attention towards solutions rather than threats. Consistent language patterns also influence self-trust. When the inner voice uses clear, supportive, and directive language, the brain associates challenge with competent rather than failure. This association builds emotional endurance, allowing individuals to remain engaged under pressure without becoming overwhelmed by internal resistance. Reframing failure is a central mechanism in building mental resilience because the brain's interpretation of an event determines its emotional and behavioral response. Failure, in its raw form, is simply an outcome that does not match a desired expectation. It carries no inherent judgment. The judgment arises in the mind through interpretation, language, and attention. People who experience repeated negative emotional reactions to failure often strengthen neural circuits associated with fear, shame, and avoidance, making future challenges feel threatening rather than instructive. The act of reframing interrupts this cycle by consciously altering how the brain perceives the event. When failure is reframed as feedback rather than a verdict on identity or ability, the nervous system responds differently. The stress response may still activate, but it is shorter in duration and intensity because the brain interprets the event as informative rather than threatening. This allows the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, reasoning, and problem-solving, to remain active. As a result, the individual can analyze the situation, identify actionable adjustments, and maintain emotional equilibrium. The consistent practice of reframing failure trains the brain to anticipate opportunities for learning in every challenge, gradually shifting default reactions from avoidance to engagement. Language plays a key role in this process. Internally labeling a failure as a learning experience or a step toward mastery alters neural firing patterns compared to labels such as "I messed up" or "I'm a failure." The repeated use of adaptive language strengthens circuits associated with problem-solving and weakens circuits linked to self-doubt. This process is reinforced through repetition. The brain's plasticity allows it to encode new pathways that favor resilience and adaptive thinking. Over time, reframing becomes automatic, and failure no longer triggers panic or discouragement. Instead, it becomes a signal to adjust strategies, refine skills, and continue forward. Behavioral responses to reframed failure further reinforce neural adaptation. Taking constructive action after a setback rather than ruminating on mistakes strengthens self-efficacy. Each successful navigation of a challenge provides neurological and psychological proof that obstacles can be overcome, reinforcing the inner voice as supportive rather than critical. This creates a feedback loop in which failures are consistently interpreted as opportunities, building both confidence and endurance. Reframing does not require ignoring the emotional weight of failure. Instead, it balances emotional acknowledgement with cognitive evaluation. The brain learns that negative outcomes are not threats to identity but part of a growth process, and this repeated practice gradually embeds resilience into the structure of thought itself, making it more durable under stress and more responsive to future challenges. Consistency is the foundation of lasting change in the brain because neural pathways are strengthened through repeated activation. Every thought, behavior, and emotional response forms a pattern in the nervous system. When a pattern is repeated, the synaptic connections associated with it become stronger, more efficient, and more automatic. Conversely, behaviors or thought patterns that are not consistently practiced weaken over time and may fade entirely. This principle applies to mental resilience, self-discipline, and the inner voice. Sporadic effort or reliance on occasional bursts of motivation rarely produces permanent change because the brain treats those efforts as isolated events rather than as new, reinforced pathways. The concept of consistency extends beyond mere repetition. It involves deliberate, structured practice. Consistently noticing negative self-talk, regulating physiological arousal, reframing challenges, and directing attention toward constructive thoughts creates a feedback loop that gradually rewires the brain. Each small, repeated action sends a signal that the alternative pathway is relevant and beneficial. Over time, these repeated practices transform the automatic patterns of the inner voice, shifting from reactive, fear-based responses to calm, deliberate, and solution-oriented responses. Consistency also interacts with the nervous system in a cumulative way. Small, repeated regulatory practices such as mindful breathing, journaling, or cognitive labeling reduce baseline stress and enhance the prefrontal cortex's control over reactive circuits. When these practices are maintained over days, weeks, and months, the nervous system becomes habituated to higher levels of control and clarity. This habituation reduces the intensity of emotional reactions to stress and strengthens the capacity to respond adaptively under pressure. The changes are subtle at first, but compound over time, producing a resilience that feels effortless because the brain has internalized the pattern. Motivation alone cannot replace consistency. because it is transient and dependent on external circumstances or emotional states. Motivation may trigger a single instance of disciplined behavior, but it does not create lasting neural change. Consistency, on the other hand, leverages the brain's plasticity to encode permanent adaptations. Each repeated action reinforces the structure of thought and behavior, gradually embedding resilience, mental toughness, and constructive self-talk into the default operation of the mind. Ultimately, consistent practice transforms effort into habit and habit into automatic competence. The inner voice, once unpredictable or self-critical, becomes aligned with goals, intention, and adaptive strategies. Through repeated disciplined engagement with thoughts and behaviors, the brain rewires itself, producing mental strength that is not reliant on fleeting motivation, but emerges naturally from the structure of repeated action and persistent attention. Remember, mastering your inner voice is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice. Every moment you choose awareness over reaction, every time you reframe failure into learning, and every time you consistently strengthen your mind, you are building resilience that cannot be broken. Your inner voice can either be your greatest enemy or your most powerful ally. The choice is yours, and the control is within your hands. So take what you've learned today, start small, stay consistent, and watch how your life transforms. Believe in your ability to change the patterns of your mind, and trust that each deliberate step you take brings you closer to unshakable mental strength. Good luck on this journey of mastering yourself. Keep pushing forward, stay disciplined, and never underestimate the power of your own mind. Thank you for taking the time to invest in your growth. Your future self will thank you for it.